In June 1963, the United States was busily fighting racism as the first African American students in Alabama were physically prevented from entering the university by the state governor, who stood in the door and refused to let them in. In that same day, President Kennedy delivered his historic civil rights address, in which he basically asked people to end racism. The Soviet Union was following these events and, as always, determined to show that it was better. So, in an attempt to prove that equality between sexes was a given in socialism, on June the 16th, they sent to space the first woman in history, Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova. In addition to being the first woman in space, Tereshkova still holds the record of being the only woman ever to have been on a solo space mission. And in addition to that, she remains the youngest woman ever to fly in space, at the age of 26. My name is Alex Deva, and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. When the United States started thinking about people in space, they settled on test pilots. This effectively excluded women, as there were no women test pilots at the time. The Soviets, on the other hand, had different requirements. The cosmonauts didn't have to be test pilots, but they did have to be young and sufficiently obedient. It was General Kamanin, head of the cosmonaut corps, who championed the idea to send a woman cosmonaut on one of the Vostok missions. It was the end of 1961, and the Soviet Union had just sent German Titov aboard Vostok 2 on the first crewed mission in history to last a full day. Kamanin tried to sell his idea about women cosmonauts to leaders such as Korolev, but nobody agreed to it at the beginning. In his famous diary, Kamanin wrote 3 bullet points that were central to his pitch. Quote, 1. Women will definitely fly into space, thus it is better to begin training them for this kind of mission as soon as possible. 2. Under no circumstances should an American become the first woman in space. This would be an insult to the patriotic feelings of Soviet women. 3. The first Soviet cosmonaut will be as big an active advocate for communism as Gagarin and Titov turned out to be. End quote. Eventually, this seemed reasonable, so that by New Year's Day, when the Central Committee of the Communist Party approved the selection of 60 more cosmonauts, these included 5 women. In a somewhat ironic twist, the selection for men was soon as good as cancelled, but with help from flying clubs all over the country, 400 women candidates stepped forward. The most important criteria had been experience with flying and with parachuting. In a few weeks, the list was reduced to about 60, which were then sent for medical testing. The tests went on for a couple of months, after which a commission, including Yuri Gagarin, decided on 5 women cosmonauts. Their names were Kuznetsova, Ponomaryova, Solovyeva, Yerkina, and Tereshkova. Gagarin eventually opposed the selection of Valentina Ponomaryova, despite the fact that she was by far the most accomplished aviator of them all. She was a graduate of the famous Aviation Institute of Moscow. She was a mathematician, and she had flight experience on 2 airplanes, but what she also was a mother. Motherhood occupied an almost holy position in the Russian culture, as it probably still does today. The idea of the Soviet Union risking the life of a mother would have been difficult to sell, but Ponomaryova remained on the list because she enjoyed the hefty support from the president of the Academy of Sciences, Mastislav Kildish. At the somehow opposite end of the spectrum was the other Valentina of the group, Tereshkova. She had no academic credentials to her name, and she was not a scientist. In fact, she was a textile worker, coming from a family with a single widowed mother and 2 other children. She had, however, another ace up her sleeve, which was a membership card in the Young Communist League. Not just a member, Valentina was actually a secretary of the organization, and had been quite active in her role. Add to that a couple of years' experience as a parachutist, and she was seen to be quite the ideal candidate. The initial plan was for Vostok 5 to be a dual cosmonaut mission, with a man and a woman on board. But things began to go a bit badly with both the rocket booster and the Vostok spacecraft, and so Korolev made the decision to postpone all manned flights. By now the Americans were firmly back into the race, and they were talking loudly about sending John Glenn to space. The American propaganda was heard in Kremlin, and Khrushchev, determined not to lose the Soviet pole position, ordered a manned flight out of the blue for the beginning of March 1962. Kamanin wrote in his secret diary, quote, "This is the style of our leadership. They've been doing nothing for almost half a year, and now they ask us to prepare an extremely complex mission in just 10 days, the program of which hasn't even been agreed upon." End quote. The challenge was impossible, and the deadline wasn't met. It took, in fact, a whole year before the next Vostok mission was ready to fly. But this time it was not one mission, there were 2. Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 flew in August 1962 in what was the first simultaneous flight of 2 manned spacecraft in history. It was the first time that 2 humans were in space at the same time. Korolev then decided that, rather than having Vostok 5 as a dual mission, it would be a single cosmonaut flight carrying Valery Bykovsky. The first woman cosmonaut was instead given her own solo flight, Vostok 6. This was now June 1963, and in the previous years, the women candidates had been training intensively. Through theoretical studies on the spacecraft, astronautics and astronomy, they did at least 70 training parachute jumps. They trained for high acceleration in the centrifuges and for no acceleration, that is to say, weightlessness. Tatiana Kuznetsova dropped out, and so there were only 4. The scientist, Ponomaryova, with all the backing from Kildish, was judged to be too independent and much more accomplished than the most male cosmonauts, and so after long discussions, she was also excluded. One of the things that Kamanin held against her was the fact that she smoked, drank, and took walks despite having a husband and a son. Obviously, such luxuries were reserved to men and unworthy of a Soviet mother. Of Valentina Tereshkova, Kamanin wrote, quote, "She is active in society and makes use of her great authority. We must send her into spaceflight. She is Gagarin in a skirt." End quote. Besides putting people in space, the Soviets had evidently also found a way to bring together socialism and sexism. Korolev was now planning another double flight, like Vostok 3 and 4 in the previous year. This plan involved Vostok 5 with Valery Bykovsky, a man, flying together with Vostok 6 with Valentina Tereshkova, a woman. In another attempt to hide the truth from the world, the cosmonauts were given code words. If a cosmonaut should say that he or she was feeling excellent, it would mean that all was as it should be. Feeling well indicated a danger to the flight, and feeling satisfactory would mean that the flight had to be terminated at once. And so on June the 14th, after some hectic last-minute fixes and even with a cable still attached to the rocket, Vostok 5 launched successfully with Bykovsky. His trajectory was supposed to give him about a week in orbit before it would decay. During his first day, Bykovsky did some scientific experiments and filmed the Earth from orbit. He would have filmed more, but he discovered that one film canister was empty, and another got stuck in the camera. He then attempted to study the sun's corona, but again couldn't. He did what he could, and waited the day out. The following day it was the turn of Tereshkova to launch. At 12:29 Moscow time, on June the 16th, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova left the Earth in her Vostok 6. She was 26 years old. In orbit, the two cosmonauts flew together at some point only 5 kilometers apart. Bykovsky said that he could never see the other Vostok. Tereshkova thought that she might have. They spoke by radio while TV cameras were sending live images of both from space down to Earth. Nothing terribly important happened in the next couple of days, except Soviet propaganda. One big scare happened when Tereshkova had tried to orient her ship in manual mode, but wasn't able to. If the system were to fail in automatic mode as well, it would have been a disaster. Gagarin, Titov and two more specialists gave Tereshkova more instructions from the ground, and she was finally able to get it to work. For a full quarter of an hour, she was in control of the ship's orientation. This was during her 45th orbit around Earth. Bykovsky too caused a scare, although his was more benign. In one of his radio reports, he told ground control that there had occurred the first space knock. Speculation on what the knock might have been ranged from meteors to aliens. Eventually they asked Bykovsky himself, and it turned out that the radio had caused them to hear the Russian word stuk, meaning a knock, when in fact the cosmonaut had said that he'd had his first stool, meaning, well, a bowel movement. Anyway, aliens or not, this was the first time in history that a human had had a bowel movement in space, so it still counted for something. When the time came to re-enter the atmosphere, Vostok 6 was first. Tereshkova's landing was uneventful, even though she did break the rules several times. She did not report anything on the radio. She hurt her nose by turning her head inside the helmet in a way that she wasn't supposed to, and after landing, she gave the locals all the remaining food in her capsule. Bykovsky's Vostok 5 entered soon after and experienced the same separation issues that had happened to both Gagarin and Titov. Tereshkova's report after landing, like her own nature, was blunt and open. She explained what she did and what she was unable to do and why. She complained about not being able to clean her teeth, about the spacesuit becoming uncomfortable after the first couple of days, about the sensor belt that was wound around her head, giving her headaches. She said that weightlessness wasn't a problem in any way, and that even though she did vomit once, it was because of the food, not the space. Once again, she had to face that peculiar form of Soviet sexism. Korolev, Kamanin, and the rest were wholly dissatisfied with Tereshkova's performance. The flight surgeon was blaming her for not performing any medical experiments, and the general agreement between the men was that women shouldn't fly to space. This was not just untrue, but patently misogynistic, since nobody had called Titov a complete failure, despite having been far sicker during his mission than Tereshkova in hers. Her mission, even not a total success, was certainly far from being a failure of any kind. None of this was, of course, said publicly. When the huge Soviet propaganda machine was set in motion, no detail was too small to be thrown in the face of the Americans and the world. Tereshkova was the first woman in space. In fact, it took the United States 21 years to catch up with that. The first American woman in space was to be Sally Ride in 1983. Coincidentally, she was also in space by June 18th, just like Tereshkova. But the Soviets didn't just put the first woman in space, they put the second one as well. She was Svetlana Savitskaya, who flew on a Soyuz mission in 1982, and she became the first woman in history to walk in space. At that time, she already had no fewer than 14 international aviation world records. Speaking of world records, another Soviet victory was that Bykovsky broke the record for longest stay in space at 4 days, 23 hours and 6 minutes. He had traveled solo a total distance of 3,325,957 kilometers, a solo record that still stands today. To give you a sense of perspective, that's like flying to the moon and back 5 times. And since we're on the subject, the overall record for the longest stay in space is still held by a Russian, not a Soviet, because Valery Polyakov spent 437 days in space between 94 and 95 after the fall of the Soviet Union. One thing that the Soviets wasted no time in flagging to the Americans was that Tereshkova's mission had lasted longer than all 6 American space flights combined. This was a political victory, a lot more than a scientific achievement. Something that Valentina Tereshkova had in common with the astronaut Sally Ride was that they both married spacemen. Of course, their respective weddings took place 19 years apart. Tereshkova married cosmonaut Andrian Nikolaev, and Ride married astronaut Stephen Hawley. None of these marriages were particularly successful. Some historians even claim that the Soviet one had been arranged by the Communist Party, and it might well have been. But an important thing happened on the occasion of Tereshkova's wedding. Because it was such a huge and rare occasion, Korolev himself was allowed to attend, despite the fact that the ceremony would be in the international spotlights. The risk was taken, and the inevitable happened. Some Western correspondents who were at the wedding, in chatting with the other guests, discovered Korolev's identity. A few days later, his name featured in the New York Times. However, the CIA didn't put much stock in the news, and there was no attempt to kidnap or kill Korolev. Not being killed certainly helped Korolev carry on his work, and having already sent a lander on the moon, it was time to aim even farther, to Venus and Mars. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.